Hi everyone, it's Odetti here, and it's been a little while since we've been on screen. Our team took a short hiatus the past couple of months, but we're back, we are energized, refreshed, and just in time to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of Ora-Ora Live. So it was March 2020 when we filmed our first episode with artist Hallie Jang, and 1 year and 34 episodes later, here we are. So we're kickstarting our first episode of 2021, which is also episode 35, at one of not only Hong Kong, but Asia's oldest independent art institutions, Parasite. Founded in 1996 as an artist-run space, it has grown into a contemporary art center, engaged in a wide range of activities and collaborations with art institutions, museums, and so much more. And of course, when we think of Parasite, we think of our guest sitting next to me, Cosmin Costinas. He is the executive director and curator here. So thank you very much, Cosmin, for being here with us today.
Lovely to be with you.
It took a little while to plan all our schedules and everything to get you here, but here we are. There is so much that we actually want to speak to you about today, your different roles, obviously your curatorial experience and expertise. So to start, obviously, what's most obvious, we're here at Parasite, so let's talk about that. So you joined Parasite in 2011, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And,
almost 10 years ago now.
10 years ago, wow, it's a very, very long time.
It's a long time, yes.
And throughout that experience, I know you've gone through an expansion, you guys moved here to the new space, and I think to start off, what a lot of people want to know is what role do you think Parasite plays here in Hong Kong and our art scene?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, Parasite was founded 25 years ago, so it's actually our quarter-century anniversary this year. So we're trying to reflect on our history and on our role, as you mentioned, and also at the future that Parasite could be playing in the community of Hong Kong and in the broader international community. It's a bit of a difficult year to hold a celebration, but it's probably not a bad moment to reflect and to take a step back and to think of these important issues. Mm-hmm. Parasite was founded from the beginning. I mean, it was founded in a moment of uncertainty, we like to say, but I guess the whole history of Hong Kong in the last 25 years was an uninterrupted moment of uncertainty, yes. So I think that doesn't necessarily say that much, but it opened a year and a half before the handover, so it was certainly a moment when people were asking themselves many questions about Hong Kong, about the future, when there was also this emulation in civil society, when people were taking their lives in their own hands, and there was a spirit of coming together, of organizing, and of doing things together. So I think Parasite is very much a product of those times in Hong Kong. It's also very much a product of that moment in the broader global art history, because I think the middle of the 90s was really an important moment of an expansion of what we now call the contemporary art system. So it was really a moment when institutions and roles and ways of working, ways of asking questions developed in synchronicity around the world. And that happened in different ways in different places, but I think this type of institution, the artist-run space, as Parasite was at the beginning, actually played a crucial role in that process of expansion, and it was one of the key institutions that put in place the conversations and the system that we now call the system of contemporary art and the sort of global system of contemporary art, or we were at least calling it until last year when that whole global structure came under question. So Parasite is very much the product of its time, both internationally and in terms of like what it meant in the art scene, but also very much a product of that moment in Hong Kong. So from the beginning, it obviously looked very different. It was much smaller, right. And I think the resources were more limited than what we have at the moment. But I think it set for itself certain principles that are very much with us today, and which we try to keep and to uphold. And that was to serve the Hong Kong art scene and the Hong Kong society in general, to be a platform for dialogues, for production, for experimentation to take place locally, but also to place these critical questions of Hong Kong in a broader conversation, an international conversation. So this was very much the DNA of Parasite. It was like what it set up to be at the beginning. And it certainly came also with an ethos of serving Hong Kong society and to fill the gaps, to basically like do those things that nobody was doing at the time. And as we all know, the institutional infrastructure of art in Hong Kong a quarter of a century ago was very different than it is now, and the scene itself was much smaller. You know, even if we look at things like the number of artists who are active, and if we look at the number of art graduates, which you know is the very basis of like what constitutes an art scene at the end of the day. So achieving those aims and that original mission in 1996 meant quite a different thing than it means now. So, you know, if we look at Parasite's history over this quarter century, we would like to say, and you know, I hope it's actually true, that we actually stayed faithful to those initial ideas,
right.
And to that initial ethos as well. But we had to change in many ways in order to actually not change at all, in order to remain faithful to that mission, because so many other things did change in this period.
You mentioned, obviously, you've been with Parasite for 10 years now. What do you think how Parasite has changed within the 10 years since you've joined and since you've come on board? Obviously, we see a lot of changes, but it would be great to hear some of that from you directly.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I mentioned before, we like to think that the DNA has stayed the same, so that everything that we did was you know, to continue that legacy and to continue building on that initial set of the remit that we had as an institution. But because so many other things changed in this decade, and you know, many of them have been dramatic, we had to change as well in order to stay relevant.
Right,
so
of course.
in order to remain that platform of relevancy, of that critical platform where certain things can be asked and should be asked, and certain artistic and intellectual confrontations are to be had, we had to change the scale of what we did, as the scale of conversation, the scale of Hong Kong art scene changed as well. We had to devise new programs as well, new structures of working as well, and also like the way in which like team operated and the scale of the team. And at the same time, we had to reimagine many other things. One of the things that we did reimagine was also what it meant when we said international. Yeah? Because I mentioned from the beginning that Parasite had from the very first moment this identity as a local organization that is relevant locally but is part of international dialogues.
Right.
But as the world has actually changed so much in the last 25 years, and a lot of like the values and conversations about what it means to be international, we had to change that as well. For example, you know, a lot of the initial contacts and collaborations of Parasite were either in a sort of very limited understanding of the region,
right.
and then also a rather limited understanding of the international, being largely centered around Western capitals and Western centers. And this is not a criticism. I mean, this is not something that Parasite did wrong. I mean, it was largely following the dynamics and the structures of power that were in place in those decades. But I think a very important process of transformation has been taking place, and of a critical dismantling of hierarchies and of you know, structures of power that are still there to a large extent, but have been seriously questioned, I think,
right.
in particularly in this decade. So Parasite, I think, saw itself as being part of these changes and actually playing a role, the modest role that we could do from our perspective here to actually contribute to that reimagining of the world and to think outside of this dynamic of Western hegemonic centers and peripheries of some sort, but rather to be critical and dynamic in a world that was changing itself, and one only had to bring these changes at the forefront in an art institutional context.
Right. And as you mentioned this, especially Hong Kong, we're going through a lot of changes right now. Like the social political climate here in Hong Kong is also kind of developing as we speak. How do you see that affecting the future of Parasite? Does it need to change, or will you be adapting kind of new programming or new dialogues to go together with kind of the overall sentiment that we feel here in Hong Kong?
Yeah, well, I think firstly, it's important to also reflect on how the social political climate and the movements that have taken place in the last 10 years actually, largely, have impacted all of us living here, and also and how they impacted us working in the arts. And I think it's important to mention that one of the consequences was to actually fundamentally affect the dynamic of audience and expectations of the audience, and of the particularly of the young generation. I mean, I think Parasite, like most institutions in Hong Kong, has an extremely young demographic as its audience. So I think if one would compare the audience structure of Parasite, and I think that's again largely common to other institutions in Hong Kong, if we would compare it with other places, I think the main difference would be the much lower age, basically. And I think this in itself, and the sort of like the expectations to visit a critical art platform and to see art not only as an opportunity for leisure, but a place where questions are being asked and where reflections on what's happening on the streets and what's happening in the politics and what's happening elsewhere in society is a direct consequence of this movement. So I think particularly after the umbrella movement, one saw that there was a particularly young audiences to congregate, to access and to own spaces where certain things are possible, certain things that were not possible elsewhere, and to have these places to ultimately to imagine a different order of things.
Right.
And as the political situation has only deteriorated in the last 2 years, or 1 year, or half a year, I think the need for such spaces is even stronger.
Right.
I think that has always been at the core of what Parasite is, and I think that's the only thing that Parasite can possibly and credibly do in order to remain truthful to what it is, and to what so many people have invested in over these past 25 years. So a bit of a long and
not at all,
and winding answer to your question, but the short version is that we must absolutely remain as open and as critical as possible.
It's very important. I guess with changing times, let's do like a more broader question, not just Parasite, but institutions in general. How can institutions continue to stay relevant and to attract, like you said, the younger generation to come, or whatever the case is, and to continue with this conversation and be active in these dialogues? I think there are certain values that I think institutions need to uphold. I think they need to be honest to themselves and to their audience. There needs to be a certain level of responsibility and of integrity. I think everybody, working in this field needs to ask themselves some fundamental questions when they work, of like, does this really need to happen? Does this need to be an exhibition? Does this need to be an event? Is this something that we actually want to say at this moment, or is this something that we really want to facilitate
because that's often what an institution does to facilitate other people to be saying things, and what does this mean, what are the repercussions, the implications. So one needs to be responsible for the things that one puts out there. So I think this is crucial. I think in a post-pandemic world, speaking globally, in a more precarious political situation, in the case of Hong Kong and of many other places, sadly, in recent years, we can't really get away with the same sort of mentality of production for the sake of it, and moving from one event to another, and uncritically and mindlessly very often, has really been seen quite broadly in art previously. I think the other thing that is also very important is to practice the values that are professed in programs and in narratives in everything that one does as an institution. I think the way in which institutions work with artists, work with its own teams, work with all its collaborators, with the environment, with all the stakeholders. I think it also needs to be based on the same values that are seen in the gallery spaces. So fair pay, fair treatment, horizontality as much as possible, and democratic spirit in building institutions, running institutions, and putting visions out there. So I think this is also crucial. So again, it's another thing that I think institutions can't possibly get away with anymore, to be spaces that propose progressive values and
more transparency
and treat artists like a corporation does.
Right. It's very, very, very interesting.
Or their own teams, for that matter.
The people who put everything together. I think that's very important. Besides your role at Parasite, obviously, and another thing that very interesting talking to you before is I know that you're the artistic director at the Kathmandu Trille. I think a lot of viewers would be interested to learn more about that programming there. So how did you first become involved in that project, and what is this project about?
Yeah, so the Kathmandu Trille is an event which is now at its 4th edition, and the 2nd edition under the name of the Kathmandu Trille. So it had the first 2 editions were called the Kathmandu International Art Festival. So the first edition as a Triennale took place in 2017.
Yes.
It's an edition that I visited, and we were quite involved with Nepali art scene from before. We worked with several artists. We had several artists and writers and curators from Nepal in residency. I mean, it's part of, this was part of what I mentioned earlier of our effort to redefine what international means, to look at our region differently, to go a little bit outside of the obvious paths of collaboration and exchanges, and to acknowledge that there's a geographical connection. I mean, it's with Nepal, and there's shared cultural history to a large extent, but there's also a very contemporary reality that we often ignore in Hong Kong. That it's actually there's a significant migrant Nepali community in Hong Kong.
Yes.
So the actual connections between Nepal and Hong Kong are actually very obvious, and in many ways we should have actually connected earlier and tried to understand what this root means and what this axis actually means. So I was invited to be the artistic director of the 4th edition of the Triennale that was supposed to open last December.
Right.
And then I invited as co-curators 2 artists actually who I've worked with in the past, Hitman Gurung and Shilasha Rajbandari, who were both in residency at Parasite, and they were also involved as artists individually in a few of the exhibitions that we did here.
Okay.
And yeah, we started actually working relatively early on developing the Triennale. We had to postpone, obviously, because of the pandemic.
Yes.
So we're very much hoping that we'll be able to carry it through at the new dates,
which is end of this year, right?
End of this year. So it's planned to open now on the 27th of October and to run for the entire month of November. Here's to hoping.
Things happened.
And the plans are, there were several things that we were all interested in different ways, and several realizations that we had about what would be relevant and important to do in the context. And I think one of them was the fact that there are artistic practices that have different artistic genealogy that coexist in many places in the world, and particularly in Asia, and it's certainly something that is very relevant in the context of Nepal and not at all alien to the context of Hong Kong and East Asia. And in these sort of contemporary conversations about decolonizing the references of art history and the genealogies of art history, it's important to acknowledge that there are art histories that are alive and thriving and synchronous to, let's say, the Eurocentric based art history. So certainly in the case of East Asia, there's painterly traditions and performative traditions and many other artistic languages that are, pillars of our communities of art and of our conversations and our references of what artistic practice is. And that's even more present in the case of Nepal. So I think this was one of the starting points,
right,
to look at these practices and to understand what is the appropriate, would be the appropriate platform that an exhibition can institute in order for these practices to be shown together, to be discussed at the same time. And by appropriate, I mean all the implications of these words. So what are the intellectual, ethical, and political conditions in which such a platform could be instituted? And many other questions came from this initial one, and also when we speak about non-Western or indigenous artistic practices, there are many hierarchies, there are many histories, there are many blind spots that come into conversation. There's groups that are marginalized, there's the issue of gender and practices that are done by women that were themselves marginalized in various contexts as well, and there's often layers of marginalization that come into play when we look at certain practices. So this was somehow the starting point, and an amazing experience researching and putting things together. We managed to show a very small preview of the Triennale at Parasite last year. So this was the initial plan. So we had this exhibition called Garden of Six Seasons, which is the name of an actual garden that exists in Kathmandu.
And how was that received here?
Very well. I mean, we kept it up for quite long. We had to close for a few months of its run, but we were still open for still slightly longer than we normally keep our exhibitions open. And I think both because of the show and I think the attention, and probably also because people weren't really able to travel anywhere else, we had a record number of visitors. So it was, very well received. But again, it was a little bit of a...
It's a different way of traveling.
Yeah, it's a different way of traveling, but we were also lucky we had a captive audience, so to speak. So, yeah, that has been quite rewarding. But now we're looking forward to opening the Triennale in the context for which it was imagined in the first place. And we've been extremely privileged to have line up quite amazing venues in Kathmandu. So there's a number of buildings from different historical eras where the exhibition will take place. There's a few historical sites and 17th century ones up until the current moment. So yeah, hopefully we'll be able to do it, and for all of you to come and visit.
Yes, this October to November.
Yeah.
I think it can happen. I think it's possible.
It's possible. It's not
possible.
certain, but it's possible. Yeah.
But overall, I mean, this is also a very large-scale project. Have you seen its effect, and how has it shaped kind of the art scene in Nepal overall, or even if not the art scene, just the communities around the city and the country?
Well, I think that it's important to say that the Nepali art scene is extremely dynamic and extremely critical. I mean, it's really largely made up of a generation that came out of the civil war, but also of the revolutionary moment that overthrew the monarchical system and nationalist system that was based on a single culture and a single language, and it's a country that managed to do what few countries in the last few decades managed to do, to essentially like overthrow a system of dominance based on the oppression of an elite, and to reimagine its society and to put it on new bases. It's certainly a work in progress, and there's certainly many issues that don't work in the political system of Nepal at the moment. But again, it's one of the few cases where the country was refounded as a federal republic based on the recognition of existence of different communities and ethnic groups, and sexual minorities and gender minorities were recognized in the constitution. So there has been this moment of progressive overhaul of society that I think many of our friends and colleagues in Southeast Asia are only dreaming of at the moment. So this is very much part of Nepal's contemporary history, and it informed, I think, the practice of many artists, the conversations that take place in the scene. So I think there is an expectation of an artistic effort to play a role in asking fundamental questions and putting things under question.
Right.
So I think we played a small and modest contribution to these processes that are taking place on the scene there.
Definitely. I really hope we get to go travel. I have never been to Nepal. It's on my list.
It's in normal times without quarantine, it should be like a 4 hours flight.
Very easy.
So just like getting to Singapore.
Yes. Okay. Well, hopefully October, 1 month, we can all visit, and we can all go and see this amazing show. When we were preparing for this interview, there are a few topics that I know you mentioned were quite close to your heart and you wanted to address, and one of them being internationalism. You mentioned particularly how to regain kind of that sense of international post-pandemic. It's a very interesting topic. I'm really curious to hear your views on it, and I think let's start with basically what is your view on internationalism? And you speak about it, we needing to kind of regain that after the post-pandemic situation, but perhaps also sharing how you felt, did the art world achieve a sense of internationalism even prior to the pandemic?
Well, I think when one speaks about these issues, there's always a semantic conversation of like what is the most appropriate word to use, and there have been different versions of imagining the world as a single place or the world as a connected place from different ideological standpoints. So, and one would tend to use different words to describe these different ideological standpoints, but without really getting into this semantic conversation, I think there is certainly the value, the progressive perspective of imagining the world as a place of solidarity and a place of equality, but also of acknowledgement of the huge inequalities that have shaped the history of the world and of different regions, and the history of colonialism and the history of I think like capitalist dominance in many ways. So a place of fairness where these issues can be discussed. And I think the art world, with all its failures and limitations, and with all its layers that I think were only reinforcing the worst part of global relations, was also able to entertain quite a unique, quite a special platform for discussing these issues and for pointing out these realities, and to be able to create that common space at a planetary level, so to speak. And I think in many ways it's one of the biggest achievements that the structure of the art world has actually had prior to this pandemic. So I think this could possibly one of the biggest losses of this crisis, if we're bereft of that achievement, and if we're stuck in small worlds, in parochial realities, in quarantine spaces, and focused only on internal problems and being driven by fear and anxieties. So I think in that sense, really like one of the most important tasks we have at the moment, and when this pandemic will end or mutate into something else, that we should try to re-establish or establish again that spirit, probably on different bases, and we should actually learn from this moment when it was shown to us how fragile everything is, that we should actually try to build it on more solid basis.
Right. I guess even though now we're physically separated from one another, but there have been a lot of kind of social tensions around the world that I think have united a lot of people together, and have also kind of become catalysts for various art movements around the world. We talk about like Black Lives Matters, that's kind of shaped a great part of the art scene in the US, but it also affects a lot of us around the world. Maybe from a curatorial standpoint as well, but how do you see kind of these instances affecting perhaps the way institutions may present artwork, or even how you perceive audiences might respond to artwork that is being shown?
I mean, for sure, I think that, that was largely what I was, talking about the moments of great questions and throwing things out of their previous and faulty ways of working. I think I'm a little bit. I think there's two different answers here. So I think, like, on one hand, art institutions have the duty and the possibility to do relevant things and to take a stand and to pursue this work of reimagining things, and again, not just at the level of narratives and what you see in the limited space of the public part of the gallery, but also like what's behind it and how things operate in the offices and the boardrooms and so on. At the same time, my partially opposite answer is that it's also important to understand that we are a very small and modest player in these dynamics as art institutions, and also like as art. And so, sometimes it's also important to take a back step and to understand that, ultimately justice needs to happen in society, and maybe that can be facilitated in a different way, and doing an art project about it might not even be the most urgent thing. So I guess there's two
ways to look at it.
Yeah, two ways to look at it, and two forces pulling from different directions.
We keep on revisiting this topic of conversations and dialogues, and you mentioned multiple times, and as from a gallery standpoint as well, we understand how important it is for our exhibitions or shows, whatever the case is, to create conversations and dialogues. And we have the power to do that, at least to try. What, in your opinion, are the conversations and dialogues that we should be having, whether in the art world or people within the art world? Or perhaps what are things that we should be talking about and we haven't been addressing, or conversations that have started and we should definitely continue and go more in depth into these conversations?
Look, many things. I mean, I'm sure there's many things that people are. I don't want to be prescriptive myself, but I think ultimately it's about just trying to make a plea for everyone to do the things that really matter for themselves, for their communities, and this might mean very different things for different people. But I think it's more an invitation to stop doing things for the sake of being on that conveyor belt of production and of publicity that has occupied art institutions for so long. So I think it's really trying to understand how precious the opportunity to do something, to work, to be open, to speak to an audience now is, when we were bereft of that for so long, and in other places even more so than in Hong Kong, where we were on and off for the past year. So I think now that we understand more the value and the precarity and the fragility of our structures of operating, I think we should really use this to make things more meaningful than it was largely done before. Mm-hmm.
And how do you see, all of us who are contributing to this conversation, how do you see that we can go about to making sure that this continues? And you mentioned before that it's very important to kind of keep these dialogues open and these exchanges to continue, no matter whether we are just in our own little bubble due to the pandemic or whatever the case is. What can we do?
I mean, just do the things that really matter to us, and be honest to these things, and have integrity, and given the experience with the pandemic, and also given how limited now the space of operation is in many places, I think we should really make the most out of it, and it would be a huge waste not to do it.
Before we wrap things up, I know there is one more topic that you were very interested to talk about, and which is mental health.
Well, I mean, it's something that we're actually working on potentially for an exhibition. I think it also came very much from the reality of the pandemic, and acknowledging that this has been it continues to take a huge toll on people in different parts of the world, and people in different social and personal circumstances and economic circumstances. So it was important for us to acknowledge that important subject.
Right.
And then also, I said before that when an art institution operates, one should always ask the question: does this need to be an art project? Does this need to actually happen? I don't know if we actually really found the answer to this question in relation to this topic, but it's also relevant that mental health has been an important part of art history, actually, for a long time, and in many contexts. So in many of the genealogies that I spoke about earlier. So I think art has often dealt with dissidence from sanity, I should say. But it's also interesting to, in the context of the other conversations that we also had before of decolonization and discussions about cultural specificity,
Yes.
How these all affect mental health and how mental conditions can not only be described differently in different cultural contexts, but there's a whole area of research and of conversation about how different cultural specificity. And I'm not talking now about immobile cultures and things that are specific to continents for centuries of millennia. When I talk about culture, I'm talking about changing cultures. Yeah, is that mental health conditions also manifest differently in different cultural spaces in different historical moments. And there's many such examples of things that appear at a particular time in a particular space. I think that's something that it's important for us to acknowledge, and it might be interesting to bring in the conversation about difference and locality of how a different historical moment, different places, as a response to reality, certain mental conditions might actually appear.
Because I think even being in Asia, the topic of mental health, I think a lot of cultures have been more silent about it. It's still a bit taboo. So it's very interesting to see that.
In many places of the world, so yeah. But there has been a ghost of a mental condition from the beginning of modernity, that there was always this belief that modern life causes specific mental conditions, and this was described in different ways, in the past 200 years. In Europe, in the States, happening now in Asia, it happened in Japan, very much in the 80s and 90s. It's also something that also happens in a Chinese context.
Yes.
And it has local specificity, and it's very much a response to how society looks and shapes and moves at a certain historical moment. But it has largely been the same, let's say, general anxiety that civilization makes us sick somehow, and anxious, and it has a consequence on our psychological well-being.
And I'm sure this topic will be very relevant to all of us, whether it be in Hong Kong, around the world. It's such an important topic that I think across different subjects that we're all talking about. So we very much look forward to seeing how that develops, and hopefully we will see an exhibition about that here at
me too, hopefully.
Parasite,
let's see,
sometime soon.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, thank you again. I really enjoyed talking to you today, and thank you so much for inviting us to see your current show here at Parasite. As mentioned, Ora-Ora Live, we are back, and we'll be bringing you more episodes in the upcoming months and weeks. So please stay tuned. We'll be going live on Facebook now, YouTube as well. And for all of you who want to follow us and watch old episodes, you can catch everything on our across our social media platforms at Gallery Ora-Ora. And thank you again, Cosmin.